it actually allows us an opportunity to build sovereign capability and leapfrog to get our armed forces where they need to be by actually taking advantage of leapfrog Canadian technologies.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the BetaKit Podcast. I am Douglas Saltis, editor-in-chief of BetaKit, and this week we are talking defense tech, which is a wholly new topic for us because this time last year, Canada didn't have a defense tech sector. But the geopolitical situation being what it is, defense is suddenly very, very hot. The feds have committed to spend 5% of GDP on defense, changing procurement laws and encouraging the banks and pension funds to invest. They've even conscripted this week's guest, Matt Lombardi of defense newsletter The Icebreaker, to help map the sector. And we'll talk about what Matt found in this episode, as well as the opportunity that he sees to repurpose the tech Canada currently leads in across a variety of sectors for defense. But first, I want to go back to the whole novelty of the subject. The need for defense tech in Canada is new to everyone involved, including BetaKit, and for some, this might be an uncomfortable conversation. But as our Prime Minister recently said, there has been a rupture in the global order, and the effects are profound. This conversation is a part of that. So, what does Canadian defense tech look like? Let's dig in. The BetaKit Podcast is presented by CADSI, the national voice of Canada's defense, security, and emerging technology sectors, representing more than 1,000 companies from innovative SMBs to global primes. CADSI advocates for a resilient and sustainable defense and security sector by engaging government, shaping policy, and strengthening Canada's role with global partners. They create platforms that connect industry with decision makers, foster collaboration, and reinforce Canada's position as a reliable partner in international security. Visit defenseandsecurity.ca to grow your defense business with CADSI. All right, Matt. Last time we had you on this podcast, you were the executive director of a Toronto tech hub. I think we should start by just explaining how you came to found a newsletter or an organization called Icebreaker.
Yeah.
And like what that's about.
So that was 5 years ago when we were on the pod together. Look at the studio. BetaKit's coming up in the world. Congratulations.
Now in 3D podcast.
There we go. And also, I do realize that you prepared for this podcast during your birthday yesterday. So your birthday present is brand new, limited edition, 1 of 10, first ever Icebreaker swag.
Oh.
So there you go.
This wasn't
Happy
a
birthday.
planned promo
Happy birthday.
placement
Happy
at
birthday.
all.
These are not for sale, by the way.
I will wear this not on the podcast, but after the podcast if it goes well.
Excellent.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Man. Okay, so you were running this thing called Icebreaker, which suddenly already has swag.
Yes.
How did this come about?
Yeah. So the Icebreaker is a defense innovation network, a very simple, though not easy, simple but not easy mission statement, which is to make Canada a net exporter of defense tech by 2030. And this came about, I think, fairly organically. So I work in venture capital, and I see a lot in the world of cybersecurity. And around March or April, I was just writing a little brief to some fellow investors just by email periodically. You know, what am I seeing in the cybersecurity space? And I started to notice that more and more companies, especially ones based in Europe, were what's called dual use, meaning there's a civilian commercial application to their technology, but there's also a military application. As you can imagine, particularly countries that border Russia, like the Estonias, the Latvias, the Finlands, obviously Ukraine, Poland, this is becoming especially important to them for obvious reasons. And that the newsletter just this email list, it sort of grew and grew to about 300 people. And I kind of thought, I don't even know any of these people anymore. So I have to throw this on Substack.
It's just no longer your friends and family.
No longer friends and family. This is going on Substack so people can subscribe and unsubscribe themselves. And then Trump made this comment. I want to say it was in late April. It might have been May. And he said something to the effect of, we can't sell the NATO allies the good F-35s. We have to sell them the downgraded versions because, they're allies now, but one day they might not be. And from there, I think I don't need to explain the geopolitical situation, but all the NATO countries just went bonkers, right? I think rightfully so. So then it was this year is going to be 2% of GDP for every NATO country on defense, which is substantially larger than what Canada currently spends. And the plan now is for every NATO country to get to 5% of GDP by 2030, which represents, for every country, but particularly for Canada, just an extraordinary, it's a quadrupling of our defense budget on an annual basis. This would make the Canadian defense tech sector bigger than many SaaS verticals out of Silicon Valley. So suddenly my very tiny newsletter has 17,000 subscribers in only a couple of months. And yeah, it's sort of exploded organically from there. We write it once a week, comes out at 6 a.m. Eastern on Tuesdays, and a lot has spun out of that. It's obviously substantially more now than a newsletter, but there's just no sort of source of information in Canada at the intersection of tech and defense.
Okay, so that's the classic media hero journey. Nerd who has a passion project writes things at the right time.
Right.
Audience shows up.
Right.
And to your point, like I don't know if we'll get into the full geopolitical here, but we are certainly talking about a component of tech that is directly addressing the geopolitical, or where the interest is ramping up because of the geopolitical. From Icebreaker's perspective, you're talking about like the things you're getting involved with. This little newsletter passion project. Here are just a few of the recent initiatives that Icebreaker is currently involved with. So you are moderating panels on Canada's defense industrial strategy at dedicated events. You are working with York University on events for dual-use tech, as you just mentioned. We're going to talk about that a little bit more to explain exactly what dual-use tech is and the implications of it. You've partnered with the European Defense Tech Hub. You also have a partnership with 19 to create the Canadian Defense Investor Network. You were working on a defense tech hackathon with the DMZ out of Toronto Metropolitan University, formerly Ryerson University, and Build Canada. You might remember the Build Canada episode that we did earlier this year with Dan DeBow. And then, the government of Canada asked you and CCI, the Canadian Council of Innovators, to build a database on Canada's defense tech companies. Why is a newsletter involved in this? And does it speak to maybe how, one, the sense of urgency,
right,
but maybe how emergent this defense tech space is for Canada?
Yeah, I think you're bang on. It's sort of in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king type of deal. Okay. If you have a little bit of knowledge and you're willing to roll up your sleeves, I think it's an all hands on deck mission. And the watchword right now is sovereign capability, right? Everything in Canada, a defense industrial strategy is just an industrial strategy, right? Defense is a cluster of technologies. And I think when you look at what's happening in the Ukraine right now, that Russian Black Sea fleet, the like vaunted, scary Russian Black Sea fleet, basically useless, stuck in harbor because some cheap attritable drones can defeat these billion-dollar warships. Same thing happening on the ground with armored vehicles. Same thing happening with fighter jets, which are still useful, but they're about 2 kilometers behind the front lines on either side because they're billion-dollar pieces of hardware defeated by cheap drones. So what we've seen in Ukraine has changed the development cycle on technology and defense, and it allows a country like Canada, which is so far behind on hardware, on software, on force readiness, on just the arming of our armed forces and the readiness of our armed forces because they've been so uninvested in over the past 40 to 60 years. It actually allows us an opportunity to build sovereign capability and leapfrog to get our armed forces where they need to be by actually taking advantage of leapfrog Canadian technology. So an example that I'd give you that our survey that you talked about turned up, Canada has an incredible cluster in quantum, right? That's based on the center that Jim Balsilli's built out in Kitchener-Waterloo. I always forget the title of it, but he's put a lot of money into that based on companies like Xanadu, where Canada has defensible comparative advantage right now. And these are the kinds of technologies that are the next generation of defense technology, right? When you talk about a future conflict, not everything's going to look exactly like Ukraine, right? A future conflict could look like something like, and we see this being tested every week. You read stories in the CBC or what have you, a power grid in Nova Scotia has been messed with. A banking system's been compromised. These are things that happen all the time.
Purely digital asynchronous warfare.
Absolutely.
We did an episode earlier this year about malicious actors and how so much of 50% of internet traffic now is non-human, and a third of that is malicious agents trying to lie to people or do stuff like this.
Absolutely. Okay. And so what our surveys turned up is that Canada has actually an incredible critical mass of technologies in discrete spaces that can allow us to become, if we invest in them, outside of the kill chain, by the way. These don't necessarily have to be offensive technologies. They can be, but they don't have to be. Canada has a massive critical technologies and entrepreneurs building in spaces where we can become net contributors to NATO in the areas where we choose to sort of put our wood behind the arrow. And I would further double down on this and say, again, to just riff on quantum, where we are in quantum today is where Canada was in AI 6 years ago, right? The world was at our feet. We had all the best researchers, all the best talent, all the best IP, and then we fell behind on commercialization, right? We should not let that happen in quantum. And if a defense industrial strategy can be a catalyst for that, where we can put real money behind this area of comparative advantage to make sure that Canada becomes the NATO leader in quantum hardened cybersecurity, for example, that is going to be an incredible thing for our contribution to NATO, the defense of this country, jobs, IP, security, you name it.
Okay. You are touching upon things that this audience, I think, would readily be familiar with. You just mentioned Jim Balsley, Disclosure, my old boss at Research in Motion, makers of the BlackBerry smartphone, also the co-chair of the Council of Canadian Innovators, which you're working on. You mentioned Xanadu. We actually had Christian Wiedbroek on the podcast a couple months ago talking about his quantum goals, and then again that opportunity for Canada.
Yeah.
But this is within a defense tech conversation.
Right.
You're talking about offensive capabilities, dual use things. I'm wondering if we can put a boundary around or a definition around what you refer to as defense tech, because I think we'll get to this later, but there's this consideration of what is military use, what is non-military use, what is that offensive, what is not offensive.
Sure.
Is every Canadian tech company in this moment a defense tech company? How would you define
Good question.
Defense tech maybe as a sector?
Sure. So I would say there's what you define as traditional sort of defense version one, the Lockheed Martins of the world. Mm-hmm. Everybody knows those are, companies that make kinetics, right? They're manufacturing
things that you shoot at people,
bullets, missiles, things that can only be in the domain of the government, right? Then you have sort of the V2 companies of the defense world, the Palantirs, the Andurils, right? They're trying to build software capabilities that are, the dashboard layer, the command and control layer, and in some cases they're also building hardware as well. But it's really been software as kind of the V2 innovation. Sure. I'd say the V3 innovation in defense tech that we're now seeing is what I would call and I'm stealing this from Elliot Pence over at Dominion Dynamics, the utility model of defense. And so that's where you would build something like, and this is, by the way, the challenge of our hackathon, September 20th at DMZ. You'd build something like a dashboard command and control layer for Arctic communications, right? The Arctic is a place that most people consider NATO's most soft underbelly, right? It's up to Canada in large part to defend it. Presence matters. And so our hackathon challenge is addressing a real need for the Canadian Armed Forces. It's not offensive weapons in any way, shape, or form, but what we need up there is a command and control layer that takes acoustic data, sensor data, data from all sorts of visual and auditory sources, and actually pulls that into a layer that allows the armed forces to have eyes and ears up there.
Yeah. So you're essentially describing, and we've written about this on BetaKit. I'll pop my finger up here. I'll link up here to a story we'll put in the show notes. A modern equivalent or enhancement to a NORAD circumstance.
You bet.
Building a mesh network to cover and have an understanding of a massive geography, whereas traditionally that would have been done through NORAD or actual physical planes, boats, and other things.
Absolutely. So that's defense tech, no doubt.
Okay.
It's also dual use, right? That can be used by all sorts of actors, economic actors, it doesn't need to be exclusively and only used by the Canadian Armed Forces, right? There are lots of, in that utility model of what you're building, there are lots of potential customers up there. Remember, the Arctic is also a place that, because of climate change, the Arctic is warming at 4 times the normal rate. It's becoming a summer shipping route. It's where a lot of critical minerals are stored. Like it is going to be one of the most important economic zones, and that mesh network up there is going to have a lot more customers than just the Canadian Armed Forces. So that is defense tech, but it's very clearly dual use. It's not kinetics. There's no guns and bullets there. But that is going to be a critical part of a Canadian industrial base, not just a defense industrial base.
Okay. I think that makes sense for our audience and understanding maybe how Canadian tech companies that they've heard of might play in this space, or technologies that they've heard of could be playing in this space. I'm wondering, can we get to Canada's defense tech sector and give us kind of a state of play? Because I'm wondering how many in this dual use paradigm, do we have a lot of traditional defense tech companies, or do we have a lot of traditional industrial technology software companies, enterprise-driven companies, the types of things that, we look at Nordspace right now, they're trying to do their first commercial space launch that could be then dual use brought into the defense sector.
Absolutely.
Is that more of what we have? Because I wouldn't, again, as the editor-in-chief of BetaKit, I would have told you that we don't have a defense tech sector as of 2024. I think what I'm hearing from you is we got a lot of companies that can be brought into this space because of the moment, the necessity, and the opportunity.
I think that's right. And I think if you just sort of pivot how you consider defense to thinking about it as a cluster of technologies, it becomes a lot easier to kind of see the playing field, because that the clusters of technologies that Canada has is world-class. It's just sort of about supporting those entrepreneurs and making sure that they're connected into the end user, the buyer, which is the Canadian Armed Forces. But also now, with this Rearm Europe supply chain plan, which Canada is joining, it also means that these Canadian defense tech companies will have an opportunity to sell into and through the European supply chain, right? Part of what Canada is doing is we are trying to diversify our own supplier base from almost exclusively buying from the United States. That means that we are going to be both buyers and sellers with our European partners and allies.
Perfect example of this would be Prime Minister Carney was part of a trade mission a couple of weeks ago to Germany, which they were hawking, a bunch of our energy and minerals to those markets. At the same time, they were also touring, I believe, some
Icebreaker facilities. Icebreaker facilities.
Manufacturers of submarines.
Name of the pod.
Right? So there's that immediate overlap of commerce, access to technology. And again, I'm assuming this is because all of these countries that are not the United States would feel much more comfortable if they're not purchasing technologies, materials from the United States that are either not the good ones or suddenly come with tariff charges, or we could go down the sliding scale of worst case scenarios.
Sure. I think all of those scenarios and reasons are under the broad umbrella of President Trump has opened Pandora's box of saying, we are going to essentially monetize U.S. hegemony, right? That's what tariffs are doing. They're trying to monetize hegemony. We'll see if that works for them or not. But what they've basically signaled to their NATO allies and partners is not just economically, but militarily, we have to stand on our own 2 feet. And, some people think that this is a plan by the president. Other people think that, he's just freelancing and a jerk. But for whatever reason,
it's an outcome. Non-U.S. countries are suddenly deciding that
everybody's reinvesting. Okay. Absolutely.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about you drew a line to underinvestment in Canada's military and defense since effectively World War II, right? And I think most Canadians of our age that grew up with Canadian heritage moments on TV would be familiar with that idea of Canadian peacekeepers, and we had military successes. We had a role to play on the global stage. That has not been a reality for let's say at least 30 years. Generally our adulthood. In some of the materials that Icebreaker has pulled together through work with CCI and others, you're calling this kind of a Gutenberg moment for Canada. So understanding that we haven't been paying attention to this, understanding that understanding that the United States is doing something, even if we don't necessarily understand the intention behind what the U.S. is doing.
Right.
Can you talk about what this moment is, the opportunity is?
Yeah, absolutely. So in this survey that we've conducted with CCI for the Government of Canada, the purpose of it was to map the defense industrial base and to make sure that they had a good understanding of the Canadian suppliers and the technologies that they're building. What we found, so we had almost 500 companies reply to the survey, which blew us away. We whittled out, some of the vendors and got down to the actual critical technologies. So 428 is the number that you're left with.
Talk to me again about those critical technologies in that 428 number.
So we mapped them against, NATO has a list. It's called the NATO critical technologies or NATO operational priorities, but there's a list of, quantum, what have you. Canada's strengths fall in three buckets: quantum, ISR, so intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, and then critical logistics and automation supply chain.
Classic B2B SaaS.
Classic B2B SaaS. Okay.
I know there's a component of our audience that picked up being like, I know what they're talking about now. I'm familiar with this.
And so across these three areas, you can say that Canada has defensible comparative advantage. And, we've heard from companies. Here, I'll give you an example. You talked a little bit about, the impression that Canadians have about peacekeeping. Mm-hmm. Guess how many active peacekeepers Canada has in the world right now?
Like 20.
Yeah, it's about 40. I think that number would blow most people away because it's sort of what I like to call like a zombie reputation. It's a reputation that people used to think Canada had for like being this, robust contributing peacekeeper, but we're actually not anymore. And that is in part because we've allowed our military to atrophy so badly that we're now not equipped to do those missions anymore. And so along with that atrophy has actually come an atrophy in public support for the military and support across civic society. Across academia, the banking system. Mm-hmm. The military has been considered for a number of years to be kind of gross, this isn't a thing you talk about in polite company. Nobody wants to invest in anything resembling arms. And so what we've come to now is a situation where I've heard from a number of defense entrepreneurs, and I'll give you an example. A guy called me up from Kitchener-Waterloo. I won't say who it was because he wouldn't want me to. And I've heard a variation of this story 5 or 6 times. He called me up and said, not Jim Balsillie. Called me up and said, hey, I do light manufacturing. I make a cold plate or like a heat sink, just a component part that goes into a light armor vehicle. Okay. In some cases, he had built it for the CF-18s. So totally legal industry, selling into allied countries only. This guy told me that over the last 18 years, he has been debanked 3 different times by tier 1 Canadian banks. And when I say debanked, I don't mean you can't get a loan anymore. I mean, you get a letter and your money's got to be out of the checking account.
Yeah, they don't give you access to financial services, essentially.
And this has been, and so I've had entrepreneurs say to me, I can't even tell my neighbors what I do because defense is, considered not a polite thing to talk about. I try not to tell my bank what the end use of my component piece is because this continues to happen. And so really nice, Matt, that you and CCI are doing this mapping survey for the government, but we're not going to show some leg just because the government whistled at us for the first time in 40 years. We don't believe it.
So they don't want to participate in the database. They don't want to be tracked by this.
So all that is to say, like, culture eats strategy, right? Every time. And so the culture has to evolve in this country across banking, across civic society. We heard Minister Jolie say this a couple weeks ago. She was encouraging the Canadian banking system to participate in the defense tech sector. That's sort of step one. The financial plumbing actually has to work for defense entrepreneurs. Our survey turned up that 75% of these 428 companies are already exporting. Right? But 30% of them are considering leaving Canada because they can't find any business here. They're selling to all of our NATO partners and allies.
This week's episode of the BetaKit Podcast is presented by CADSB, the Canadian Association of Defence and Security Industries, the voice of more than 650 Canadian defence, security, and cyber companies. I'm BetaKit CEO Siri Agrell, and I wanted to know, How is CADSI helping Canada's cyber and emerging technology sectors grow? And what can we expect from their upcoming Cyber and Digital Outlooks event taking place in Ottawa? Joining us is Mark Waters, a cyber policy analyst at CADSI, who works on issues shaping Canada's defense and cyber future. Thanks for joining us today, Mark.
Yeah, I'm very happy to be here. Thank you.
So tell me, what is CADSI and how do you support Canada's defense and security industries?
Yeah, wonderful. So we're an organization that's been around for many years. At the moment, we represent about 1,000 defense and security companies across Canada, and we help them successfully manage their relationships with government.
Well, this is an interesting time for that kind of work, right? We're seeing a lot of increased focus on Canadian defense. How do you see that impacting your members?
Yeah, so that's a very interesting question. We hope that it will positively impact our members. But we know that there are a couple of challenges in terms of sort of turning that reality of this interest and focus in defense to the actual sorts of contracts, relationships that would benefit our members. And so far, it appears that the government is making progress, but we could always use a bit of an uptick in speed in delivery.
Now, you guys have an event focused on this coming up, right? What are the cyber and digital outlooks, and why are they important for Canada's tech and defense ecosystem?
Yeah. So when I joined CADSI about 8 years ago, we didn't have much of a relationship with the cyber community, and we had to decide if that was going to be an important component to national security. Long story short, we ran a number of interviews and engagements and sort of figured out there was a gap in the market. And there wasn't an event out there that helped government communicate its specific needs to industry. And so we went and built CDO to see if this would fill that gap.
So when is it happening, and what are the sort of key trends or issues that you think people are going to be talking about this year?
Yeah, so it comes up on October 30th here in Ottawa. We host it at the Rogers Centre. And we cover a wide range of topics. We have everybody from the Cyber Force commander in his new role talking about dual use technologies. We have a lot of the sort of key D&D groups across the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Special Forces talking about what they need for everything from offensive operation to defending ships and planes. And then we also touch a little bit on some of the enterprise aspects in government, like through shared services. So we do cover a pretty wide gamut, so every company gets something out of it.
Why do you think that people who are working in this sector should think about attending?
Number one, and it's kind of a point of pride for us, the government to industry ratio that we have at this thing is pretty much untouched. Last year, for every 2 people in industry there was a person from government. I think a lot of the events you go to, you get more like a 10-to-1 ratio. And this year, even though we're expanding the audience, you're just going to see, uniforms and those in suits from government are going to be almost as present as industry is. So your opportunity to engage is pretty much unparalleled in that regard.
So this is where the buyers are when it comes to Canadian tech.
100%. Yeah. And I mean, like pretty much all of them.
So this is going to be, I would imagine, a really, really interesting room. Can you tell me a little bit more about who you're expecting on the government operator buyer side?
Yeah, absolutely. And that is a great question. So we definitely, as I mentioned before, we're going to see a lot of the people who are responsible for using these technologies. But I think it's also really important to note that in our opening plenary, we get the full leadership that actually represents, the cyber and digital interests of the military, as well as shared services and CSE at the table. And so it's not to say that we won't hit those high level strategic issues. They're absolutely there, but they're going to be connected to the themes of the acquisitions that are following from them. So you're going to get to hear all the way from tip to tail exactly what it is that the military wants and why they want it and when they need it and how they want it delivered by industry. And I think that's the unique opportunity the event presents.
So CADSI is a membership-based organization. Can anyone attend this event?
Yes, and that's an excellent question. For a lot of our events, you do need to be a member. But I think for us, because we're really trying to reach a new community here and one that's really just emerging into the limelight, this is open to members and non-members alike. And we're super happy to welcome those non-members in because it gives us a chance to show off a little bit and show them what we can offer. Yeah, it's going to be a blast. And of course, track me down and find me. I'm happy to chat with anybody and point them in the right direction. So
awesome. Okay, well, thanks so much, Mark.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. Have a great day.
CADSI continues to play a vital role in supporting Canada's defense, security, and cyber industries while fostering innovation in emerging tech. The upcoming Cyber and Digital Outlooks event will bring together leaders to discuss key issues, challenges, and opportunities shaping the future of our country. To learn more and get involved with CADSI or to register for the Cyber and Digital Outlooks event, visit defenseandsecurity.ca.
We'll talk about the financing component in a second because that's a huge topic of conversation. But what you're touching upon again is something that would be familiar to anyone following Canadian tech across industries, which is this procurement issue.
Yeah.
You're talking about, again, I don't think we can even step past the fact of this culturally, economically, through all active intention, Canada has moved away from military and defense to the point that the current Canadian government that is setting this a priority had to go to you and CCI to build them the list. And the people that should be on that list don't want to be for understandable reasons. So like that's state of play. The other item that I want to get to that you're touching upon in the survey is procurement, which is a cross-industry issue in Canada that we know that Canadian businesses and governments aren't that interested in buying Canadian. Historically, 2025, you've heard a lot of build Canada, buy Canadian. Just before recording, we're at Carney was announcing the major projects initiatives, that new office to be building things, whether it's transportation, high-speed rail across Canada, energy components like liquid natural gas all over the place, Canadian sovereign cloud. And a few weeks ago at an announcement that was effectively about helping industries impacted by tariffs, just snuck in a little requirement there that for procurement contracts with the government for defense and construction, foreign and domestic companies would have to actually start looking to procure from Canadian organizations. Detail to us in which ways Canada's procurement issues are the same or different in the defense space.
Yeah, I think BetaKit readers and listeners will know that the buy Canadian procurement issue is an issue in every space. I would say in the military, it's particularly acute and novel in the sense that there's really only one end user, right? There's one buyer, and so oftentimes, and so one of the ways that the government has attempted to address this, and I think this is about a 13-year-old policy now, so it's a couple governments ago, but it's through what you just mentioned, ITB. The ITB policy basically states that any large defense contractor, Canadian or non-Canadian, that wins a contract above a certain dollar threshold, and there's a multiplier effect in play, has to put some sort of value or equivalent value back into the Canadian economy. And they can do that in a number of ways. The most simple way is through using Canadian suppliers. Mm-hmm. You can also, you can invest in things like, and there are categories, training is a category. And so if they were to make an investment alongside, say, a post-secondary institution, they'd get a pretty healthy multiplier. So $1 gets you, say, 9. And so over the last couple of weeks, there's been a little bit of a drumbeat from folks like Ian Whittock at Tidal Venture Partners, who wrote a great piece around ITB reform and said, there's $15 billion in backlogged ITB obligations sort of hanging out there. Could that money be given a healthier multiplier to incentivize it to go into the venture space as LP dollars, for example?
What's creating the backlog though? Because and we'll link to the Globe story in the show notes. Like the complaint seems to be it's putting a cap on long-term investments into small and medium-sized businesses. Is that because they can't find a way to get the matching investment contribution back into the economy? Is that like what's backlogging it?
Every defense contractor will give you their own reason. So I don't know that there's a one size fits all, but I do think that we've heard enough from the tech community to say that there are some policy tweaks that could be helpful in terms of releasing that backlog and making sure that that's money that we talk a lot about building sovereign capability. There are going to be certain things that we still have to buy. The submarine procurement, for example, right? The government's announced a short list of 2 potential suppliers for the new diesel-electric submarines. Neither is Canadian. We don't build subs here. That's okay. We can buy things from other NATO countries. We can also sell them different things. Mm-hmm. But when they win those contracts, they should, to the degree that it's possible, buy Canadian and use Canadian suppliers, right?
Gotcha.
And so the ITB policy just has to be, I think, tweaked to make sure that they're properly incentivized and I think this new Buy Canadian requirement is hopefully going to be rolled into part of what we know is the forthcoming defense industrial strategy in November.
So the government has this expectation that it happens, but they're also setting a mandate for it to happen. So these opportunities don't get lost in this long contract timeline. And then, as we hear from so many Canadian companies, it's like, man, in the US, we can do something in 2 weeks that in Canada would take 6 months to a year.
Right.
And then, okay. What are some of the other components of this that need work? Like we were talking about all of these dual use tech companies, the opportunity for them repurpose. We're talking about the interrelation between the economics of them selling industrially and then also having it available for the defense military components. Are we building this stuff locally? Do we need, like some of the sovereignty component is the parts should come from here because we can't trust that pick your US defense contractor isn't going to put some sort of like digital software lock if you're buying those materials. And do these companies that could be dual use pulled into the defense tech sector know what it means to be in the defense tech sector? I'm assuming there's some sort of compliance considerate.
Sure. Yeah.
I'm assuming the defense industry has like another list of things that they need to be doing.
Right. I'll give you a short example on that. One of the pain points that we surfaced was Canadian companies who are already selling abroad to other NATO governments or to other foreign defense primes serving NATO governments have told us that the backlog to get a security clearance, which you need to respond to an RFP, is 18 months. So as you can imagine, oftentimes they'll just say, well, this is not really worth the time and the risk. We'll just move on to selling abroad. So, I think there are, sometimes that higher bar can inadvertently create a friction that, hampers domestic sales. And so when you, again, click a level deeper and you say, well, what was it like selling into the UK or selling into Australia? And they'll tell you it's the same rigorousness of security vetting. It's just done more quickly.
Yes. We can't have an industry if it doesn't functionally proceed at a 21st century pace.
Right. I think there are some quick fixes on that front that will hopefully remove some frictions for Canadian entrepreneurs to sell the things that they're already selling to other NATO governments, but sell them domestically. You talk to some of these entrepreneurs and they'll tell you the only reason that I'm still here in Canada, it's because of my family. But I'm selling abroad. I have no technical challenges in Canada. I have no talent shortages in Canada. The only thing that's lacking is a market.
Gotcha. Okay. And then, because you had mentioned before an interest in or statements around like there's a risk vector that these defense tech adjacent companies might leave. We've talked a lot about like brain drain when it comes to young, cracked 20-year-old founders going
an IP
YC.
drain.
Yeah, for in the AI space, we've talked about IP drain. Again, a bunch of recent episodes on the podcast that you can check out on that. Is it the similar consideration there, or are there other specifics that are causing people to leave? Because this is the one component that if you're probably in this space, if you are truly let's say a defense tech first company rather than a dual use company that could do defense tech stuff, I would assume that Canadians are going to stay as long as they can because you don't start work in that industry to go expatriate. So is it the same as the AI, IP and talent brain drain that we see where there's just more money and more capital externally?
I think for the most part, if you were building pure and only defense, you just would not have begun building in Canada in the first place.
Gotcha.
Because there definitively has not been a market for that type of thing. Now that Canada is, I think, getting serious about investing, at least dollar-wise, into sovereign capability, I think if you are building dual use, it now becomes more feasible. If you look at the dollar figures that are about to be spent, I think you could rightfully assume that there ought to be a market in the very near future, and so the prospect of needing to relocate hopefully becomes less of a burning platform, just for the purposes of finding your first buyer, your first customer.
Okay. We talked about the government doing some work to make that a requirement, like to light a fire under that. Assuming the timelines to get certified, regulated, and procurement like go down or become 21st century, that's check 2.
Right.
Let's go back to the money consideration and like who's actually going to pay for this stuff for there to be a market.
Sure.
Obviously, you said off the top, this current Canadian government is looking to kind of meet this new 5% of GDP on defense by 2035 NATO commitments. You had also mentioned that Industry Minister Melanie Joly is encouraging the banks and pension funds to start backing the sector, which has been not only, again, traditionally it's not something they've pursued, but they've been debanking companies that play in this space. They don't want to touch it. At that time, and BetaKit has written about this, you can go check it out, Minister Joly also noted that BDC, the Business Development Bank of Canada, could be helpful in being a catalyst there.
Right.
BetaKit's Josh Scott did a sit down with BDC CEO Isabelle Houdon, where she said specifically that BDC is going to get, quote, more aggressive in supporting this sector, particularly in shifting one of their deep tech funds over to incorporate defense tech, which I think speaks to, again, this dual use nature and where some of these key technologies are. The question I want to ask you is, given how poor venture performance has been in tech broadly, and given how little the pension funds invest in this space in Canada, are these the right channels to be supplying capital? Like this interview with Isabelle Houdon happened at the exact same time BDC was releasing its performance results. And while they have continued to commit more capital into tech, the performance of their investments hasn't gone great. And BetaKit has written several times now in the past 2 years about frustrations that Canadian VCs have with their LP investor, BDC, also competing with them on deals at the direct level. Like, are these the right channels, or are these just the only channels that we have?
That's good. Okay.
It's kind of crazy.
Let me unpack this question. There's a lot to unpack here. So let me just separate out the pension funds for a second.
From the banks and BDC?
Yeah. So from the Canadian banks perspective, just from the stories that I've heard, I just want to say to the banks, do better. These are private institutions, so they've got their own shareholders to worry about for the most part, publicly traded. But they've got to do better for Canadian businesses in general. And I think I don't think there's an entrepreneur in Canada who wouldn't agree with the joke that the Canadian banks are with you, win or tie. I'll switch gears to BDC and to a degree EDC. These are crown corporations. They have
just for everyone, explain how EDC comes into this.
So Export Development Canada just being another crown agency that potentially will be involved in things like project financing for an LNG terminal, which would be sort of broader defense spending under the NATO 5% target.
Got it. Again, getting these things out to other international markets, NATO partners or other Commonwealth countries, things like that.
Absolutely. And so when you look at EDC and BDC, that's different than the Canadian banks because EDC and BDC have a single shareholder. That's the government of Canada. It's a taxpayer. They will only be able to do what their mandate allows. And so up until now, EDC and BDC have not been allowed to be in the defense space. And so, I think just giving them the mandate to do so is a great first step. Do we know what their specific, fund allocation and or direction will be? We don't know that yet. But I think
it seems like it's going to be significant.
I hope so. I hope it is.
Would you like when it comes to that 5% number of GDP? Are you expecting that BDC is responsible for committing that envelope of capital? Like, is that how this is going to work?
It's too early to say. I expect that we'll learn this as part of the defense industrial strategy alongside the budget. But certainly, when you look at some of the really smart folks who are on the BDC capital side, like a Duncan Stewart, who's been at the Deep Tech Fund, there's a guy who, given his background, knows tons about dual use, right? I think when you look at EDC and BDC's sister organizations in other NATO countries, they have all been in defense for years. And our Crown Corps have not been allowed to. So I think it's only natural. I think they will have plenty to learn from their counterparts. And again, the concept of, maybe this is my bias, but like BDC and the concept of catalytic capital, like sometimes catalytic capital is meant to be, it's meant to be upstream of, where the immediately most juicy returns are, right? Because it's catalytic because by definition, maybe nobody else is there, right? You're trying to catalyze a space. And in Canadian defense tech, we do have a bit of a cold start problem. So I do think this is an appropriate place for BDC to play.
Okay. I look forward to seeing how that plays out relative to the other industries BetaKit covers. And I'll just leave it there. I got maybe three more questions.
Wait, sorry. Can we talk about the pension funds?
Oh yeah. Let's go back to the pension funds.
So the pension funds again, and I think again, a qualitatively unique envelope of players. The Maple 8 are considered, globally best in class investors, institutional capital. Our mutual friend Matt Roberts has some strong views on what the Canadian pension fund mandates ought to be, and how much they may or may not need to be changed to mandate them to invest more domestically.
Matt Roberts, for just anyone wondering, a venture capital investor, formerly of BDC, Scale Up Ventures, his own fund, and now actually works at a bank, doing with their venture support at RBC.
But I think Matt's written extensively on this. But every country is going to, with its public pension funds, every country is going to calibrate the mandate based on, in part, unfortunately, whatever the political zeitgeist is of the day, but also based on national economic priorities. And so my expectation would be, just listening to what we're hearing from NATO countries and governments about, sovereign capability being the watchword of the day, would I be surprised to see almost every other NATO country tweak their pension fund mandates and us to have to follow suit? I wouldn't be surprised by that at all.
Okay. That's actually probably a good transition into the last couple of questions I want to ask you, a little bit more kind of rapid fire to get your perspective on this.
Let's do it.
And one of the ones I want to ask you is like, what countries should we be mirroring ourselves after? And broadly in tech, there's a lot of like, we need to be more like the US,
right.
Silicon Valley is the blah, blah, blah. Other people usually point to Israel as a country that has a good government support catalyst for tech and innovation there. That comparison becomes a little bit more fraught when we're talking about defense tech. But when you look at whether it's other NATO countries or Commonwealth countries, non-US countries, let's say, that have an integrated system, that have an industry around this, that have a market for it, where would you be looking for mirrors of this is being done well or seriously or effectively?
I'll say two that are a little bit off the beaten path that no one really ever talks about, but Sweden and Finland. One, similar climates and concerns in and around the Arctic. So, some of the same cold weather challenges. And two, because of their proximity to Russia, both of them are, I would say, overprepared as opposed to Canada, which is I think largely been a laggard in preparation. And so, similar-ish climate issues, and they're just several years ahead of us in terms of like civil defense, all of society preparedness. Things like leveraging frontier technology because they're the smaller country relative to their adversary.
Yeah. Okay. That's a really troubling thought that we've been behind in considering our proximity to a localized Russia. But I'm going to jump on past that because that's not this type of show and ask my next question. I'm wondering, because you highlighted some companies off the top. We were talking about certain types of technologies in this space, either as core defense tech companies or again, that dual use.
Yeah.
Can you just name some Canadian companies that stand out?
Yeah.
And noting again, because you are a VC, just disclose if you've invested in any of those companies as you name them.
Absolutely. So I mentioned Dominion Dynamics earlier in the show as it pertains to like an Arctic mesh communications network. I am personally an angel investor in Dominion Dynamics. Again, dual use, non-kinetics, meaning not weapons. But the Arctic is a place where not having a persistent presence, Canada not shaping the rules of engagement, we're sort of now not supervising our own backyard, and that becomes problematic economically, militarily, politically, and in so many ways.
Especially if someone else wants in our backyard,
and everyone else does. There are Russian and Chinese sensors and patrol ships constantly in the Arctic. China now considers itself a near Arctic state. Like, look on a map, they're not, but they've decided that they have the force to project and try to claim a piece. So domain dynamics hugely important for what they're trying to do in the Arctic. And as BetaKit just wrote about, they've established a new partnership with the Arctic Training Center that Arjun Grewal runs. Shout out to Arjun. Another company that's super cool, and I have to talk about these guys. It's called North Vector Dynamics. I'm also an angel investor in this company.
BetaKit has also written about them.
BetaKit's also written about them. These guys are doing counter drone technology in hypersonics. Don't ask me to explain the science. Paul Ziad, the CEO, has a literal PhD, is a genius. This team are all Oxford trained. And these guys are essentially putting together a piece of what could probably be considered a candidate for usage in something like a Golden Dome, which we've heard President Trump talking a lot about, a larger missile defense shield. But the point...
Or have you just been paying attention to what's happened in the news and in Poland specifically with drones?
Absolutely. I do think that what Paul and the team are building out in Calgary is an incredibly important defensive technology.
You had mentioned off the top Canada moving away from this as a cultural, societal priority.
Yep.
And that the companies that you're talking to in this space don't speak necessarily about what they do because it is considered in a sleepy country next to one of the largest global markets of verboten and maybe archaic consideration. That doesn't seem to be the time that we're in when our prime minister is announcing defense procurement requirements along with trade war supports and offsets.
Right.
But I do want to speak to the people that I think understandably would be very uncomfortable with championing military innovation, given all the other types of things that we do. And again, just not a long history of, let's say, direct, aggressive military use. Do you have an answer for those people that in this moment are uncomfortable with the idea that like their favorite tech and startup publication or podcast is now writing about defense tech, or that we have to?
Yeah. A couple things. One, the first thing is Donald Trump. We no longer can rely on living under the protective security envelope of the United States. So, unless you want to put your faith in Donald Trump, we need to do this, right? We need to stand on our own 2 feet again. Our military has a very proud history. The Canadian forces were the only of the Allied forces that achieved every one of their objectives on D-Day. And pretty much every day since the end of World War II, we have underinvested in our military and allowed it to get to the state that it's currently in. We're now going through a period where we're going to be reinvesting, but we have a very proud history of standing up for what's right as a country militarily, using force only when it's needed, and we have to do that again. It's not really optional. And number two, and this is an economic consideration, we have the best entrepreneurs in the world. And if we don't support them, they will go elsewhere. And they've been very clear with us on that. So, even from an economic perspective, we talk a lot about like the defense industrial strategy. It's just an industrial strategy.
I think that's a point well taken. I don't think in this current climate and moments, we want the standard Canadian innovation story to happen in this industry.
We're getting a mulligan on how we botched up AI.
Okay. I think that's maybe a good place to leave it. This has been an interesting conversation. I really appreciate you adding some context to a space that BetaKit now has to pay a lot more attention to. And I hope that will be enough.
All right. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for the hat. And I know you came in not feeling very well today. So excellent performance.
Feeling better now. Thank you again for having me. And BetaKit's coverage has been excellent.
Awesome. Yeah. Expect more defense tech coverage on BetaKit Canada, whatever that implies.